Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another webinar edition of Rio Wong Consulting. Today, we are talking with my friend and guest, Dianne Morales, who is running for Mayor of New York City. Whoa, what? Welcome, Dianne.
Thanks, Ria. It's great to be here with you.
So the last time we spoke, Dianne, you were a CEO of a nonprofit, and that was probably about a year ago. Now you are the only female candidate running for the mayor of New York against some very seasoned politicians. So what inspired you? What happened from point A to point B?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, I am no longer the only female candidate. However, I was the first, and I am also the first Latina to run for mayor of New York City. I never really aspired to political office. I spent my entire career working in the community and helping low-income communities of color navigate the systems that really weren't created for them so that they could access academic and economic opportunity. I've always worked sort of shoulder to shoulder in the community and with the community. About 10 years ago, someone told me that I just declared that I was going to be the first Latina mayor of New York City. And I totally laughed it off and dismissed it. But suddenly other people started telling me the same thing. It really wasn't until after the 2016 election when I even started to think about how else could I use my skills and experience to make a difference. And then at the end of 2019, when we started to see this surge of women running and being elected into office, that was when I first started to even allow myself to think about what it could look like. And I think the more that I opened myself up to it, the more I realized that my own experience as a Black Boricua, first generation college graduate, single mom, puts me in a position that I actually have more in common with the average New Yorker than most politicians. And that my professional experience in creating innovative strategies to help marginalized communities overcome these barriers and challenges is, I think, exactly the kind of skills that we need to work toward creating long-term change in New York City and in people's lives. I guess I believe it's really time for us to redefine who's qualified to represent and to lead us, what they look like, and what kind of experience we value. And so at that point, it's like, why not? And why not me?
I love that. And you know what I really appreciate about that is I think women so often hold themselves back because they're like, oh, I'm not qualified, or I feel like an imposter. So I am, kudos to you for stepping into that. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit in more depth about how your experience as a nonprofit leader and as an educator has really played into your vision for New York.
Yeah, I guess the first thing that I would say about that is I think that my tenure as an executive, managing multi-million-dollar budgets, supervising hundreds of staff, partnering with businesses and other stakeholders in the city, really give me a clear sense of what it takes to successfully oversee a complex organization like New York City with lots of moving parts. I think, I've been equipped with the experience of having to align different departments and different interests so that they're working in concert and sharing information and, improving performance, increasing efficiencies, working towards a shared vision and a common goal. I also think that I have a clear understanding of what it takes to create change. The idea that it's just not enough to make decisions at the top and expect that everybody's going to execute on them just because. It really takes an investment to make sure that everyone in the organization feels valued, that their experience and expertise are factored in, that they're part of sort of co-creating a vision, and that they feel good about the work that they do and like they're doing a good job, right? I think that if leadership spends time investing in bringing along all of the members of the team, they're much more likely to be successful. I think that the last thing I would say about this is that my perspective as an educator and a social worker are also critical to the vision and what I see as possible for New York City. I understand the importance of that work specifically in helping our most vulnerable and marginalized communities to overcome the inherent inequities and disparities that they confront by virtue of race, gender, and class. And I think that I understand that the role that those systems can play in perpetuating those challenges. So I see where we need to make the changes in order to address the underlying causes of those burdens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say, listen, I think the leadership, the political leadership in the city has been far too insider. And so you see these like career politicians who all think the same and they're all cut from the same cloth. So why not someone from the outside who can really see things differently?
Yeah, I mean, because one of the things I think that this current crisis has made crystal clear is that the old systems and the old paths have led to this, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a real sort of moment in time and window here where we can make a conscious decision to leave those things behind and to create things in a new and different way that you sort of distribute opportunity and access in a whole different kind of way.
Yeah. I saw this really great quote from Brene Brown yesterday, and I'm going to butcher it, but essentially, like, to go back to the old way doesn't make sense because the old way upheld, white supremacy and inequality and da da da. So, can we use this opportunity to stitch a new cloth?
Yeah, there's another quote also by Arundhati Roy.
I love Arundhati, right? She is
Right?
like my personal hero. The God of Small Things has changed my life. Anyway, please continue.
Yeah. So she just wrote something called "The Pandemic is a Portal,"
Ah,
right? And in it she talks about actually, if I can bear with me, I think I might have it here. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew.
mhm.
This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. Um, we can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little baggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it.
Kudos to
Yes.
that. Yes, all the things. You, Arundhati Roy, all of the women of color. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, I'm going to change over to a policy question, and I want to just invite folks on the call. I'm going to open it up for Q&A in a couple of minutes, so if you have any questions, feel free to get your thinking caps on. So, Dianne, you and I know each other because we are both in the education space, and so education is certainly near and dear to my heart as it is to yours. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about your perspective about reopening schools, and can we expect that's going to happen in the fall, and how do we do so safely?
Right. So I think I'm going to tip my hand a little bit because this is definitely one of the sort of policy sort of ideas that we're putting together and getting ready to go public with. I really think that, I don't think, first of all, I don't think that we're going to be ready in September to return to school as we know it. That being said, I also, and connecting to this, to the quote that I just read from Roy about sort of the opportunity to sort of leave some of our old baggage behind. I think this is a window for us to really reimagine schools. And so I think that, if we maintain the idea of social distancing, that's going to be necessary. I don't think we're going to resolve the testing and tracing issues in the next few months and do it in a robust and sort of thorough enough way to just feel safely, like we can go back to the way things were. So I think that there's a way for us to leverage the human services nonprofit sector, their expertise, and their physical space resources to really sort of redistribute and reallocate our student population. I'm thinking about sort of the idea of deputizing these organizations to provide education services and supports to our kids, right? So we've got the community school model that we can build on where nonprofits have been partnered with education and schools. If we did an inventory of space that's available in the nonprofit sector, of staffing that's available in the nonprofit sector that has education backgrounds, and sort of redistributed our student body along sort of those lines, and also created what I'm thinking about as sort of don't quote me on this because it's just a label for now, like an education core. where we brought in people who were interested in becoming educators, where we partnered with CUNY to think differently about how we train educators, where we partnered with the UFT to support that, right? I think that this is about sort of increasing the teacher pool and the quality, and the supports that the teacher pool has access to. I also think that the nonprofit sector has a lot of experience in this. The Department of Youth and Community Development several years ago actually copied an idea that I created as the CEO of Phipps Neighborhoods when I developed a model, an after-school model with education specialists that were actually educators, previous teachers, school heads, who were supporting our after-school programs and providing sort of rigorous and robust education components. That model was scaled, and so all of the Sonic programs and the Compass programs from the city require somebody to have an education specialist. We could build on that. We could ramp that up. We could also think differently about the school year, right? This 9-month September to June. There are other places, right? There are other places who do it differently. We can think about the school day differently. So much can be done differently, I think, to provide the opportunity for our kids to get back to school, right? Again, throwing out sort of the traditional model, for parents to sort of have that, right? Because I just don't think right now the virtual education is really working. It's certainly not working in the same way for everybody. So those are sort of some of the threads of what I see as possible. It would mean having to start yesterday in terms of planning for this and preparing for this. But I do see it as being possible.
Yeah. And, I think there's all sorts of new interesting possibilities as well. For example, I think that there's going to be a lot more available space at co-working spaces and storefronts. So that's an interesting idea.
Absolutely. Commercial spaces. Absolutely. I think that kind of thing. We have to be really creative about how we approach this. And we have to, I think about how we involve as many sort of different sectors and stakeholders in the community in making these innovative experiments successful.
So I'm going to switch now to another question that I know is on your mind and certainly on mine, which is the question of racial equity and equality. When we think most recently of de Blasio and how communities of color have been disproportionately arrested for social distancing or violating social distancing norms. Stop and frisk obviously is another example. Clearly problematic. The other piece that I'm thinking about personally is you joined us in our webinar last week, which is about the rise of anti-Asian sentiment in the wake of COVID, and a lot of the examples of violence against Asians have been committed by other folks of color. So I'm just wondering, how are you thinking about being a mayor for all New Yorkers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to make clear that we don't have enough time on this webinar to sort of get into the complexity of what that would entail in terms of addressing these sort of inherent issues in our system. But I do think that there's a couple of things worth noting in this. And one is, this is where I think education, both in schools and in the community, can play a really critical role in creating change. The reality of it is that the anti-Blackness sentiment, which is grounded in white supremacy and is the root of the racialization of minorities in this country, has really fed into the narrative around these conflicts, right? The sort of Black versus Asian and that whole idea of, the whole myth of scarcity that pits one minority group against another because, of some sort of made up notion that there isn't enough to go around, right? That grounds people in fear, which in turn turns into these racist sort of behaviors. But the reality of it is that racism against any sort of racial minority just reinforces the current structures of white supremacy and the marginalization of other minorities. So, I think there's a real critical role for education to play in that. I also think that accountability and sort of, we are not holding our police department accountable in the way that they need to be held accountable. The current crisis and our federal administration, I can't even say the name, has just further fed into those fears and stoked those fears. And it is a huge problem. I don't see the leadership of New York City really taking that on and confronting that directly. And until we do that, we're just going to be tinkering around the edges, right? I mean, we've seen all of these incidents of violence against people in the Asian community, all of these awful, awful insults and threats because of the whole idea that they brought the virus into the city, well as what you referenced in terms of the disproportionate enforcing of social distancing rules in our communities. The police department needs to be held accountable for that, and that means more than a slap on the wrist. It's unacceptable, and there have to be serious consequences for those behaviors.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a much deeper question, but I hear you and I agree with you, which is how do we really attack the root of the issue around white supremacist culture, and stop tinkering around the edges. Like, what I know about you, Dianne, is like you are fearless and stepping into the fire. So. I mean, look, you're running for mayor. I want to invite folks on the call. If you have questions, feel free to throw it into the chat, and I can call on you as we wind up this Q&A with Dianne, between me and Dianne. Okay, so Dianne, I'm just going to ask like the everyday woman question, which is like, all right, Dianne, why would I vote for you? I mean, there are all these other politicians running with a lot more experience in government and city government, and why would you get my vote?
Excellent question, Ria. So yeah, I mean, yeah, there are more experienced politicians running for sure. These people are, and no offense, but they're people that have spent a large part of their lives and their careers working in or for the government, calculating their sort of career ladder and their next government position, exchanging political favors in return for support from people who are going to help elevate them. But there isn't another candidate in the race that I know of that provides the kind of combined personal and professional experience that I do. And by that, I mean, I have lived many of the challenges that the average New Yorker experiences. I've challenged the Department of Education to provide the necessary services to my children who struggled with learning differences. So I understand the frustrations of dealing with that system. I have, struggled with trying to navigate and access mental health supports for my daughter when she was struggling with issues. I have fought with the chief of police when I witnessed via FaceTime my son being harassed and racially profiled by a police officer with a hand on his holster, right? So, I've lived those things, which I think are experiences that so many New Yorkers have. And the flip side of that is, on a professional front, I have helped communities navigate and overcome those kinds of things, right? So there is something that I believe exists at the intersection of those experiences that positions me uniquely to be able to not just represent New Yorkers, but also to problem solve and to tackle these challenges, as you said, head on, in a fearless way that is unencumbered by owing anybody any kind of favors, or I don't have those kinds of relationships or those restraints, so I have nothing to hold me back. And so I think if people really want change and really want to see something different happen in New York City, then I think they should take a look at my campaign and follow along.
All right, so last question before I open it up to the audience. I know that you are running a really different type of campaign. It's grassroots, it's being funded by individuals, small dollar donations. Tell me a little bit about what you need in order to get to the next level.
So, New York City has created a campaign finance program that actually is intended to make it a little easier for folks like me to enter, campaigns, to run campaigns. They provided, there are 2 matching programs, and the one that I'm participating in provides an 8-to-1 match for donations between $10 and $250 from every New York City resident. And so that's that's an incentive, and it makes it a little bit easier. The flip side of that is, and these are sort of the hills that we still have to climb, is that we have to meet two thresholds. One is 1,000 New York City residents donating to the campaign, a minimum of $250,000 raised from that pool of 1,000 donors. So we are right now in a sort of heavy push to try to meet both of those thresholds. We are about to wrap up tomorrow, actually, a 10 by 10 by 10 campaign where we're asking anybody who's even remotely interested to consider getting 10 of their friends to donate $10. It was over a 10-day period, and tomorrow is the 10th day. So that is, that's one of the things that we're doing right now. And, we're just constantly fundraising, and I'd like to kind of check those boxes so that I can pivot and focus on what really matters, which is, the policy side and planning for the kind of vision and changes that that we'd like to see. So right now, that kind of support is going to make a big difference and would be greatly appreciated.
All right, y'all. So you heard it here. Tell your friends, donate to the cause if you want someone like Dianne Morales on the ticket. So I have some really excellent questions coming in. The first is from Emily. Emily, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. So I read an article this morning that talked about de Blasio's executive budget proposal, and the cuts that he has proposed to education that total, the number that I found was $641.8 million.
Yep.
And along with that, only a $23.8 million cut to the New York City police force. And from what I'm seeing, this doesn't align with your plan for a more equitable New York City. So I'm kind of wondering what the approximate pie chart of your budget would look like.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can't give you sort of specific numbers right now. We're actually in the process of working with a couple of economists to do those calculations. But my answer, the headline for my response is 3 words: divest and reinvest. I would be really, really focused on divesting those additional resources from the New York. We don't need more police officers. We don't need, the kind of force that is being identified to go into the MTA. What we need are resources for the community so that people are safe, so that people are healthy, and so that they have housing, right? And so I would really look to kind of reverse, not exactly necessarily, but we really need to invest in the things that are most important. And that connects back to sort of my original, part of my opening statement about using this moment in time to reassess what's important to us and creating a budget that reflects our values, that in fact elevates and supports those people who right now are being so disproportionately impacted by the crisis, that despite that, we have deemed the most essential of our workers, right? There is an inherent tension in the fact that our essential workers are like 79% people of color, and reflect about 63% of the mortality rates. Despite the fact that they're only like 25% of the overall workforce in New York City. I think that the disproportionality of those numbers reflects something really problematic, and that we need to, moving forward, create a plan that centers those people, because I think that those folks are what make it possible for the rest of us to survive. And if we in fact prioritize those individuals, the collective will benefit.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Question coming in from Russell. Russell, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I've heard referenced recently the upcoming decade of mental health. And Dianne, I was wondering kind of what you're thinking about incorporating broadly improved access to mental health services, and also to kind of normalizing the conversation about the effects that trauma plays, both sort of trauma coming out of the current moment, but also recognizing kind of a long-standing cross-generational trauma, inherited trauma?
Yeah, so I will say, as the mom of a daughter who has struggled with mental health challenges for a large part of the last 6 years, I first of all, I have firsthand experience with the challenges in our mental health system and the supports that are available to everyone, specifically through the lens of adolescence. At the time that my daughter was struggling with these issues, I think there were about 14, listen closely, there were about 14 adolescent mental health beds available in all of New York City. So there is a scarcity of resources, which is the first thing, despite the current administration's investment in mental health services. I don't think that those dollars were invested or allocated in the right ways. I think we need to increase the pool of providers that are available. There's a variety of different ways that we can do that, through partnerships with the CUNY system, through partnerships with larger sort of mental health institutions. I also think we need to your point, normalize the narrative around mental health challenges and trauma. Everyone has some sort of issue, right, that they could benefit from being addressed, or being able to sort of talk about or address in a more public way. And so we need to, I think we really need to integrate that perspective and that lens into our schools in a whole different kind of way, into our workplaces in a whole different kind of way, and into sort of our cultural narrative in a way that destigmatizes mental health challenges, that creates the space for healthy discourse around it, and that also provides the treatment. The reality of it is that a large percentage of mental health issues actually are not sort of on the most extreme part of the spectrum, right? If you think about it that way. So we need to create a more robust system from one end to the other, while increasing the access and sort of the triage, if you will, the front end interventions, so that we can sort of decrease the spigot on the back end, if that makes sense. And I think that there's a way to do that that actually makes it much more, I can't even begin to describe the challenges that we faced, both in terms of like just waiting, in the hallways of emergency rooms for days on end, and also just the conversations, or the difficulty in having conversations with education professionals, if you will, as to what was happening, right? So all of these systems need to be, I think, much more closely knit together, so that we can have a much more comprehensive and holistic approach. I'm sorry, I could go on and on about this, but I think it's a multi-pronged strategy and approach that weaves this into the public discourse, and also ramps up the professional supports that are available to everybody.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Russell. Really excellent question coming in from Sabrina. Sabrina, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. First of all, Dianne, I want to say thank you for joining us. This has been really informative, and getting to know you, feel that you share a lot of my values, so thank you. Recently, I have been looking back to history to try and understand the city a little bit better. I've been living here for a few years, and I'm reading Fear City, which, as I'm sure you know, is about the 1970s fiscal crisis, and how the imperative to rescue the city from bankruptcy sort of changed the heart and soul of the city. The city gentrified much further than it ever had before, and now there's like a Dwayne Reed and a Chase Bank on every corner, where there were mom and pop shops. But I want to ask you if you could talk a little bit about sort of the challenging time ahead for the local economy. I feel like even in this sort of gentrified city, where it's sort of like it's the tourist destination, it's very sanitized. There's a lot of theater, which is a great thing. There are a lot of restaurants, which is a great thing. But I feel like a lot of the assumptions that we have that keep revenue coming in, and that keep, the city going, a lot of those things are going away. Restaurants are struggling. The experiential event market is obviously just gone right now or temporarily on pause. So what are you going to do to sort of boost the economy in the future if we're still struggling with the after effects of the pandemic?
So I'm going to respond to that in a couple of sort of different ways. One is sort of a more philosophical response, and that is that, you know, there's the need for us to move away from this sort of individual liberties, individualism mentality, and move more towards what I believe is, you know, like a communitarian approach and a collective approach. And the idea that, you know, what has right now some people protesting so that they get their individual liberties back and the ability to go back to work is actually really code for, I don't want to go back to work. I want people that serve me to go back to work so that I can get my services, right? And I think we all know who that refers to. So I think there's a philosophical framing or ideological framing, I think, of recovery that needs to be shifted in terms of how we approach this. I also think that while, yes, there's going to be a significant impact on the economy and revenue, that also is not reflected proportionately across the board. And so I am very interested in looking at ways that there can be more of a shared sort of sacrifice, if you will. And I think it's important in the messaging around that to bring across sort of a table of cross-sector stakeholders together who understand the need and their responsibility at this point in time in helping to sort of elevate the city, as well as the longer term potential for those people and who put some skin in the game on the front end. And I think that, you know, and the revenues that we do have, what I would be interested in looking at and what I would be interested in doing on the front end be to look at the revenues that we do have, the things that the mayor does have control over, and really looking to, as I said before, create a budget that reflects our values. That's not to say that, you know, it's not a panacea. I'm not sort of suggesting that there aren't going to be difficult times ahead. But I do think that there's a way for us to prioritize the people that have been sort of impacted the most, to create cross-sector partnerships that sort of share responsibility around elevating those groups and those communities, whether we're talking about, you know, I think there's a way to bring small businesses together with businesses, with real estate interests, to sort of make a new sort of new social contract that agrees to sharing the pain proportionately, and investing in the front end so that we can all do better in the long run.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on that question, Dianne, I mean, as you know, my husband is also in hospitality, and I think that the hospitality and the restaurant sector has been hit particularly hard. And so, you know, what makes New York great is that there are so many restaurants and bars and all these sorts of things. And what's terrible about it is that the competition makes it such that it's an unsustainable business model, but also that it's been hit particularly hard by the closures and COVID. Question coming in from Carlos. Carlos, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yes. Hi, Yuria. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Dianne, first of all, just want to say this is very exciting. As a Latinx person, it's very inspiring that you are considering running for mayor. But
Doing this, Carlos.
We're getting there. But my question is, what are your ideas for supporting families/individuals who have been barred from supports and legislation that aims to provide relief from the effects of COVID-19? An immediate example is the stimulus check. We have many undocumented folks and mixed status families who don't have access to that, and like it doesn't look very promising some of the proposed legislation coming from the governor, which requires documentation for potential, what's it called, for requesting rent freezing. You would have to provide like evidence that you have been on some kind of, you know,
Payroll.
payroll. Yeah, there we go, exactly. And not many people are going to be are going to have that privilege.
Mm-hmm. So the first thing I'll say is that I think it's absolutely imperative for us to provide protections to everyone, whether they be undocumented immigrants, whether they be people who haven't had the benefit of being on payroll. I think you know, that the sort of core premise of the idea of a new social contract is based on the notion of valuing and supporting and elevating all of those folks who, again, have made it possible for us to sort of survive through this period of time. I have been a supporter of the cancel rent movement. I think that cannot be done in isolation, though. I think we need to look at the, you know, just to take that example for a second, we need to look at the homeowners, right? I'm not talking about, you know, landlords that own tons of buildings or luxury buildings. I'm talking about the small, you know, mom and pop, you know, 2-family, 3-family homeowners, and we need to provide them with some sort of mortgage relief as well, because, you know, it doesn't help to pass on the burden from renters to those you know, smaller homeowners who then run the risk of losing their own homes. So those things I think need to be coupled, but we need to recognize the reality that there are, you know, more renters in New York City than owners, and we need to provide protections for those people. So we need to, you know, we also need to provide, you know, in terms of the aid and the relief that's not being available, being made available to folks. We need to find a way, again, to prioritize and exercise our values in how we allocate our resources. So I would advocate strongly, and you know, in the position as mayor, would prioritize finding access to resources for those folks in the community.
Dianne, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about your positions on undocumented folks and DACA students, because I think, you know, certainly this is an issue near and dear to my heart, having worked with a number of young people who were in this position and had issues when applying to college, for example, and getting financial aid. So I'm wondering, can you say a little bit more about your policy position on that?
Sure. Well, I believe that the undocumented folks in this country are actually helping to drive so much of our economy, whether we choose to acknowledge that or not. And so, you know, I think we need to be looking at creating pathways, making things easier for them, not harder. I think that you know, the differences in policies that we have implemented towards you know, white European immigrants versus immigrants coming up from the South are you know, you can't deny those differences, and we've got to recognize and value the contributions that those communities all make towards making it possible for the country to run. And so I would be looking towards ways to protect, to help sort of create, you know, pathways to entry, and definitely to support DACA students. I mean, that is somewhat, you know, one of the most egregious things that we've ever done, I think, in terms of not protecting and supporting young people who, you know, for many of whom never lived in whatever country we're ascribing to them, and for whom the United States is home.
Any other questions from the folks on the call? We have a little bit more time.
I have another question, if
Please.
second questions are allowed.
Yes, absolutely. Please, Emily.
So my question is, you touched on it a little when you were talking about rent freeze and mortgage relief. But I'm wondering on a grander non-COVID specific scale, what your sort of ideas for your policy ideas for regulation around renters and landlords are. Specifically, my mom is a small private landlord. You know, she owns a 3-family house and she rents 2 of the units. And there's been a lot of legislation circling lately about kind of the regulations that would be on her, you know, single home that she owns and lives in, even though she has 2 rental units. So kind of focusing on what protections for small private landlords would look like, as opposed to, you know, separating that out from giant conglomerates that own, you know, millions of units throughout the city.
Yeah. Emily, can you say a little bit more about what some of those regulations are that you're referencing that have been sort of around lately? Or
yeah, sure. So a lot of them referencing kind of evictions for, you know, solely based on cause, not being able to, you know, just take back a property that you own without having like, you can't, like, now if you want, you can just evict a tenant because you want to, you know, have your unit back, your apartment back that you own. But there's been a lot of legislation circling about evictions only for cause, deeming that small rental units, you know, have to, you know, must take Section 8, different things like that, that, you know, would disproportionately impact landlords that don't own rental units for profit.
Sure. Oh, I totally get it. I mean, I guess those are things that I would be opposed to, right? But I think there needs to be a balance. And I say this as a homeowner. I have 1 rental unit. I think there needs to be a balance between my ability to, I mean, it's my home. I want to be able to claim that space if I want it. I also want to be able to provide the tenant with the appropriate amount of notice and the time to do the search and to find it. You know, I don't think a 30-day notice is enough. I think that that's not fair, particularly in the housing market in New York City. But I do think that I should be able to exercise my right as a homeowner, particularly. I want to make sure it's clear that I think there's a difference in small homeownership versus with large real estate, owners and luxury developers, that kind of stuff. And so I think there's a balance, right? There's a balance that we have to walk, a line that we'd have to walk that I think is possible to walk, that both protects the homeowner's rights while providing some sort of safeguards for the tenant so that they're not just like ruthlessly evicted and end up on the street.
Great. Thank you so much. That helps a lot. Basically the reason I'm asking is because I'm trying to get my mom on your side. And I know that's one of her biggest.
Gotcha. I'm happy to talk to your mom if she'd like.
Thank you so much.
Emily, we'll make this audio available after this call as well, so you can send it to your mom.
I love that. Thank you.
So,
Rhea, hey, it's Russell. I have another question.
Please go ahead, Russell. I think we have time for one last question, so this will be the last one from Russell.
Great. So, Dianne, I imagine you've been watching the de Blasio-Cuomo dynamics over the past couple of years. Yeah. And I'm wondering, what have you said to yourself? Oh my gosh, as mayor, I could do this so much better. I could collaborate with state leadership in so much more productive ways. Like, what's some of your thinking around that?
Yeah. I mean, I have to admit, I have totally had that thought, right? I have totally had that thought that despite my issues with some of the decisions that Cuomo has made, I don't, by any means agree with a lot of the decisions that he's made. I do feel like there is a way to collaborate and work with people who are, not 100% aligned with you. And I think that there's been a male ego dynamic here that has really, really not served us well. I think that there's been something, as evidenced by our current mayor's presidential run, there's been sort of an eye outside sort of current role. And for me, the reality of it is I'm not looking to become sort of a next sort of career politician, right? This is not something, oh, if I become mayor, then, what else am I going to do? This is sort of the thing for me. And so there'd be a sort of, I feel like a singular focus on being able to create meaningful change in New York City that positions us to really be a model for the country and maybe the world as the greatest city, right? We should live up to the rhetoric and the sort of aspirations of New York City. So that's one thing, is being really focused on that. I think the other thing is just, I do feel like I have a lot of experience navigating successfully relationships and partnerships with people who I don't see eye to eye with on everything, but doing it in such a way that ultimately both gets me sort of the resources or sort of progress that I need, while helping while leaving the other person feeling like they've been successful and they've gotten what they wanted. So I think that's a skill. I think that's an art. I think that's a personality thing. And I also, being able to negotiate and being able to be diplomatic in doing that while also still not compromising your values and your principles and what you believe in, I think is something that that I do particularly well. So I definitely have looked at that dynamic many, many times and thought, oh, I'd love to sort of have a shot at that. I put my money on me.
Excellent, thank you.
And I do think I think the theme of this whole conversation is like, how can we do things differently? And I read this really interesting article about how models of female leadership is actually much more effective in this time of COVID, because women tend to be much more sort of consensus builders, relationship builders, collaborators.
Yes, it actually is a statistical fact that women in Congress have successfully passed or gotten more legislation passed than their male counterparts. And that's just statistically true. And that's attributed to better being able to negotiate, a greater focus on sort of the collective rather than sort of individual ego issues. And so there is something to be said for that. And I think it's being modeled or sort of demonstrated worldwide right now in the midst of this crisis. When you look at the places that have handled this better than us, they're generally being led by women.
Angela Merkel, we see you. The future's female, y'all. So in the last minutes that we have together, Dianne, and thank you so much. This has been so great, and so glad that folks have been able to learn more about you and about your policy platform. What are the big takeaways that you'd want people to know about you, particularly, for Emily's mom? What can she say to her mom that is essential to know about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I tend to say, and this isn't mine by any means, but I really believe that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that the individual pursuit of happiness is inextricably linked to the collective. And so I think if that's, if there's one sort of headline about sort of me and what I stand for and what I represent and what I'd be working for, it's that. Before the crisis, I was advocating for the centering of women and communities of color as the key to building a more inclusive New York City where everyone benefits. I believe that this pandemic has totally highlighted the deeply entrenched disparities in our city and brought the issues of my platform to the forefront in a way that I don't think we can unsee. And also, I think there is transformative potential in this crisis. And so, I think that we can move towards real access and equity. And I believe that, it's possible for us to tip the scales on these disparities that are both institutionalized and structural. And so that's, I just don't think that we can go back. And mine is a rallying cry for us to not miss this moment as an opportunity to really create transformative and radical change for the city.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Dianne. Folks,
Thank you.
you get the word out. Dianne needs the 1,000 donors and $250,000 by what date again? June, end of June, is that right?
So June 30th, the technical deadline is July 11th, but we've got to do all the reconciliation. So we're shooting for June 30th.
June 30th. Okay, so put the word out there. If you want Dianne Morales as your next mayor of New York City, you know what you
Or
got to
even
do.
a candidate.
I'm going all the way, Dianne. I'm not going halvesies.
Love it.
All the
I love
way.
it.
Dianne in Gracie Mansion. Thank you so much to everyone for being on the call. Thank you, Dianne, for your time. I will make this available later this week and send it out, and appreciate you. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.